So, I don't have any clever B-roll conversation to go into this topic. Uh, I'm just glad to be here and glad to be speaking again. Doing this whole thing about podcasting and jumping into this is a commitment. And at times, it's so easy to jump out of these commitments. But these healthy routines of doing things that we enjoy, doing things that are creative, doing things that show our capability, help us, help us grow. And we should always be checking for each other and checking to that and never just sort of gloss over. And I feel like, even though I didn't mean it, that's a perfect segue into what I want to talk about today. This is the LCSW, the podcast, with me, Omar Green, LCSW, a podcast about all things mental health. We're a fledgling podcast. We have like one listener. I'm talking into the void right now, but we are on all platforms, so that's kind of cool. But I wanted to talk about something that I've noticed throughout my practice. It is sort of the inaccurate diagnosis of substance use. And how, in this first segment, I wanted to talk about how, ironically, it goes both ways. So, in my time, as a mental professional, I have seen a lot of people seeming to almost really quickly and almost without hesitation diagnose people with a substance disorder. A person comes in and they say like one or two symptoms: are you smoking cannabis? Are you using alcohol? Are you doing this? And instantly they have a use disorder. And I've always felt troubled by that. Because on some level, substance use disorder is about excess. I'll get deeper into it, but people use substances. As I was talking to someone earlier about that, there's people out there that have glasses of wine with their steak for dinner every single night. They don't have alcohol use disorder. They just have really nice taste. So, I came into this discussion thinking like, man, people are getting really overdiagnosed. And I had concern with that because inaccurate diagnosis in general leads to inaccurate treatment. Just a very simple, almost common sense type of thought. If you don't know what the problem is accurately, then you don't know what the solution is accurately. And there's like a lot of time and efficiency wasted because you have two parties, the patient and the provider, both trying to help each other have collaborative care. And they can't because they're going in the wrong directions. And they're missing each other. And especially from our side, the provider side. Because, to always push this notion forward as mental health providers, I would want to say almost medical providers, but I can't speak for them too much because, even though technically I am one, it's LCSW, humble brag, I am not a doctor, and so I don't know their code of ethics. But at least from the social work side of the table, the onus is on us. It's always on us to make sure something happens. It's not on the patient. The patient can help. The patient has some responsibility. It's not on us. It's not on them to be the person that carries home whatever task or objective that goes wrong or that should go on in treatment, and that's included in accurate diagnosing. The one thing I kind of say to people, and actually it's rarely, I said this to a colleague of mine who was a prescriber once. I said, we're the ones that are educated about this. They're not. Some people do a good job of self-education. They go on WebMD, they buy themselves a DSM, and they read it up, and kudos to them. But your average Joe is just like, yo, I need help. Please help me. When I go to the doctor, I don't read up a medical book. I go, hey, this hurts. Please make it stop. And so there's a lot of psychoeducation and a lot of questions to be asked. And so when I saw these diagnoses, it concerned me because it can make people view patients in a different way. You view a substance use patient as someone, and I've seen it, that not to be trusted, someone that needs extra supervision, someone that needs extra, time in some form of psychoanalytical talk therapy, whether it be individual or, and I've seen a lot of people get pushed in IOP programs. I've seen people who don't have any substance use symptomology at all be pushed with substance use programs. These programs of the state, they have no oversight board. They have no person that easily to complain to and to refute that claim. And they're trapped in that. And that's the horrible thing, is that these people are seeking treatment and seeking help, and they find themselves in vulnerable situations to a organization or a provider or a series of providers, and they're essentially, I don't want to say trapped, but they're put in a very undesirable and uncomfortable position because for some of them, they're mandated to do these things after they're hit with the diagnosis of substance use disorder. And for some, they could find care anywhere else. I advocate for people to have the rights to find, to make sure that their care is collaborative, and if they're not okay with it, and they are, they feel like their care is being compromised to a point, to find care somewhere else. I've always said that self-determination is honestly the bedrock of ethics when it comes to good care. And so, to see all the people in these tough positions because they're inaccurately diagnosed, and I've been there. I've seen people diagnosed, and to the point where I got to check. I go through the diagnoses, and I think this is where I talk about me being a little surprised because everyone has their bias, and so so when I did it, I would see people throw a substitute diagnosis on some patient, and I would immediately recheck and be like, okay, do you have X, Y, Z? Do you have this symptom, that symptom? There are 8 to 10 different symptoms of substance use. And I think sometimes what, unfortunately, some professionals do is that we go through this sort of haphazardly, and we hear someone say one thing, and then we go off to the races, and we say, okay, you must have substance use. So I'm looking at a diagnosis now. There are 10, right? Is anyone asking, do you have recurrent use resulting in failure to fulfill major roles or obligations at work, school, or home? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think a lot of people are, because I ask these things. And then, a lot of the patients say no. I asked, if you had to cut it off right now, could you cut it off right now? Which is another symptomology, right? So that's an unsuccessful effort to cut use. And a lot of people say no. So I think, when we are presented with that and we ask the questions, it's so important to go through the symptoms and ask them in a way that the patient can understand, so they can accurately get that. And that goes both ways. Because I did read, I researched for this, because I do research for the podcast, just because I don't want to seem like I'm just talking out of, out thin air. It goes the other way. There's underdiagnosing. There's people that may feel like substance use is an issue, or whatever motivation, and they don't ask questions, and someone's not going to tell you something unless you ask a question. I mean, they might, but a lot more times than not, they will just let things be as they are. And so, literally running through the diagnosis, and I can at least run off at least 6 or 7 off the top of my head, and the other, 3 or 4, I can easily look in the DSM to ask to verify that they meet that threshold for a use disorder. Because I said before, it's a really serious thing to have that. And in our second segment, we'll get into, the policy 42, I think it's 42 CFB Part 2, which is all about the stigma. You get stigmatized, because I said, like, this is a huge stigma. You get stigmatized from your provider, and they treat you differently. You can get stigmatized from other people who look at your records. If you have any involvement with the state, whether you have a DCF case, whether you have a case in family court, whether you have a case with your PO, those findings can be crucial to you being reunified with your family, you moving forward and getting, the criminal justice department out of your life completely. And to know that some of these diagnoses are being almost recklessly put in that's what inspired me to this episode, because I see the poor bad treatment and how people are often ended up worse from end treatment when there's misdiagnosis than when they were, and they see it. They see, like, wait a minute, like, I don't have a problem with, I just kind of shared with you, to build a rapport as a patient, and I'm glad he did. A couple of things on my use disorder, and now, like, I have all this use disorder, and people are checking on me and doing X, Y, Z, and people talk, and that discourages people from just saying anything. I've had patients, for that reason and different reasons, say, I wish I could tell you this, but I know you would do X, Y, Z. And that hurts the relationship between provider and patient. And I get it. There's reasons why people would want to know that. One of the bigger reasons is you want to avoid negative interactions between, substances and psychotropics. And that's something that I've seen and heard of ever since, I worked alongside a pain management clinic within a health center. And so that's fine. But you can still notate that, because I still notate that, even though I don't give people the use disorders, without giving them the use disorders. But this oversight of withholding treatment or doing bad treatment is something to be concerned about. In terms of the ethical nature of it, I am unsure about that, but it doesn't seem like the right thing, especially because I've heard from varying providers that, they know some people are using substances, and they still prescribe psychotropics, because they realize they weigh the risk of interaction, and they realize on some level that, yes, maybe there's theoretically a risk, but overall, patients will be fine. I mean, there are patients that at baseline and their regular use substances on a regular basis and still take medication for whatever they're taking. Now, yet again, it should be noted, and that should be factored into that decision, but it goes to show that it can happen. And when I had it's where this issue is so real, I had multiple meetings based around this one issue with other mental health professionals and other therapists and some prescribers. And I asked them, prescribers point blank, would you still prescribe? And they said yes. So there is some precedent to say that having someone that's using illicit substance does not completely cancel them from using are having the benefits of psychotropics, and that trying to, and I've seen some patients try to use tax screens as a way to sort of penalize patients that if they continue to use substances, they won't get their medication. But just cutting someone off medication, I don't know if that's good treatment. That's, in a way, you can argue that is, psychotropically abandoning the client. And yet again, it puts in a hard spot because they don't think they have a problem. Some of them may not think they have a problem. Some of them really don't have a problem. And yet here they are being pushed to live by someone's standards of substance use, which isn't even the standard. The standard is about excessive use that ruins your life. That's what substance use is. When it ruins your life, when it ruins your job, when it ruins your relationships at home, when it ruins your relationships at school, when it becomes your whole life and every other aspect of your life becomes secondary. Essentially, that's what it is. When you spend so much time doing that everything else just seems not worth it. If whether you agree to it or don't, or your personal preference, may vary. Everyone has the right to, on some level, use substances that are legal, and benefit from using those things, whether it be recreationally or medicinally, as we're seeing more and more states relax their stance on cannabis, inching more and more toward legalization. It has benefits in a lot of different ways, and it's people's choice to use them. It's our responsibility as providers to make sure that those aren't used in excess to do that. So whether it's overdiagnosing or underdiagnosing, whether it's just not checking or being too reactionary, I definitely feel that that there's been a lot in terms of substance use, and sometimes it leads to stigma of clients, and sometimes I think that's why some clients don't even say that, because before, they feel stigmatized for saying it. They feel shame for once having that. And, I've had patients that, will sort of not mention certain things just because they feel sort of shame of how they'll be viewed. They feel shame of themselves because of how society has a negative thing. And I think as I kind of talk about these things, it reminds me of that sort of thing, like, is it a disease or is it a decision? Is it something that patients are overcoming, or is it the patient's fault for making a horrible choice in life? And, there's aspects of both. Most substance use are voluntarily, in a sense that, no one forces them to use certain things. So there is a decision, and it is some accountability. But it is a condition. It is a mental health disorder that once it takes hold, and it's a completely understandable one, as these things are readily available in the community, and they're not seen as poison, and they do have, no matter how they are overall, they have benefit. So I don't think it's our job to sort of judge on life decisions that people don't have perfect information about. People are born and they're just going into this world trying to figure things out, and they try things. Sometimes it doesn't work out, and sometimes it leads to something bad, and that's where we come in to help. All right, so this is my first section of the podcast, and I'm doing this clean. I have 30 seconds left. Man, I could really use a sponsor right now, so I could just plug, your ad here. And this podcast has your ad here. But I'll see you on the other side of the next section. All right. Peace.
So, I'm using my AirPods to record the second section because I got new machinery and I have to get used to it. But last time in our first section, we talked about how at times substance use disorders are underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed. And I think it's really something to be careful of because of the weight medical diagnosis brings in terms of the treatment that we talked before and having accurate treatment, just in terms of like what type of the version of treatment are people going to be put into. Is it going to be inpatient, going to be outpatient? Is it going to be regular outpatient in terms of visiting with a therapist? Is it going to mean there's going to be IOP? Are you going to suggest putting someone inpatient as a rehab or detox? Are you going to put someone in a program where maybe it's just too much treatment for that patient? And and all those issues are meaningful as you're trying to get the right treatment. Because as I said before, more at length, not to kind of go back to the first section, what's really important is having the right assessment and having that right assessment meet the right type of treatment. Because without having both, you're constantly sort of trying to play catch up because you don't really know what the problem is. And ironically, in talking, I kind of came from a little bit of bias, and I'll admit it, in terms of people overdiagnosing, and it is true. And I have had people be overdiagnosed, and I've had multiple patients where I've gotten transfers, and I literally would go through the symptomology because of that. But ironically, there was once a patient that I underdiagnosed, or they didn't disclose. I always ask about, substance use symptomology in terms of them maybe having something that we need to work on. And the person just didn't disclose to me. Maybe out of shame, maybe just because it's hard for them to admit it. And actually, I think the person said it. The person said that, it's just hard. There's so much stigma in terms of meeting social norms and everyday life that whenever we fall short, it's hard, even with a therapist. And with a therapist, you're in a confidential space, and unless you say something about hurting somebody or hurting yourself, or maybe hurting kids or mistreating kids, because that's a DCF call. Other than that, pretty much it's all fair game. And even in that space, it was the guy just didn't mention it at all. And it goes to show how before they come toward us, and us meaning providers or medical or some type of medical facility, they see us in some sense as professionals, also kind of see us as a authority figure, and having some powers to affect their life, not just positively, from getting help, but negatively. And that we have to be on our jobs to not underdiagnose, but at the same time not overdiagnose, because that really can be crucial in terms of the treatment people receive when it comes to any diagnosis, but specifically substance use diagnosis. And one thing I kind of want to focus on the second part is the stigma. We talked about it in terms of maybe being stigmatized for treatment, but there's a lot of other forms of stigma that a patient can receive that can affect their life negatively. One thing I kind of mentioned was legally. There's a lot of things that can happen to them if their records are looked up and they have substance use as a diagnosis legally, especially if you think they're by themselves. But what if they have children? Then that can prompt maybe a DCF call or for child protective services, an investigation. And I've had patients where they have not used substances, but at the same time, they are constantly having to deal with some either DCF or some related agency because of a erroneous or like a not true assessment of them having substance use issues, which is horrible. So I think that at times that it's discouraging because not only does it mistreat patients, but at the same time it discourages patients from wanting to do stuff, and I think that's why there's certain things like that happens. Like you have me, I'm out here trying to discourage any type of under or over diagnosing and proper treatment, being very sensitive when it comes to doing anything with substance use in terms of diagnosing. And then not only that, you have certain federal rules. So you have this thing called HH 42 CFR Part 2, right? And that is a provision that puts extra control when it comes to the privacy and confidentiality when it comes to patient records. I mean, and think about that. Like, patients already have a good amount of confidentiality in terms of like stuff that's provided via HIPAA and just stuff that's just thought as like an ethical part of treatment. In terms of like third parties not not even knowing that the person is treatment. It goes so far where some people can't confirm or deny whether a person is a treatment to someone who's not named themselves. It's actually, ironically, is another that's a whole nother episode that I got to talk to y'all about, because there's issues with that. And it comes like, when do you get to that point where you have those rights? Because as you sort of move throughout the years, those rights sort of grow as a patient. It doesn't just start at 18. It starts like as low as 13 to 15 to 17 in terms of entering treatment and refusing treatment. So, there's already protections, but it kind of shows that this is such an important issue, and it's an issue that unfortunately is not being tended to. And they just had and so basically the HHS 42 CFR Part 2, y'all can look that up, it's a mouthful, but just Google it and it'll pop right up, is another provision for substance use, to say that that if you have things in your record, documentation that might indicate substance use for a patient, that you have to even go through extra efforts to make sure that person is okay with those records being released to a third party, and make sure that that they're okay knowing that other people will see that, and so therefore they can safeguard themselves from persecution. So therefore, people can feel more comfortable about doing this. And there's a lot of different aspects of this. And so, even when I'm looking through the revisions, even though when I'm looking through the revisions now, and there's several revisions in terms of the mouthful of the HSS CFR that is in place. That is a mic drop. And there's several revisions in terms of everything that's happened that is in place. But one, if we're looking now, it says disposition of records. It says when a substance use patient sends an accidental message to a personal device of employee of a Part 2 program, basically meaning like you're a part of a federal program, that the employee will be able to fulfill Part 2 requirements to sanitize the device by deleting that message. And the person of that is to ensure the personal device employee will not be confiscated or destroyed in order to sanitize part two. So even when you're getting text messages about patients that might have anything connected with substance use, it's basically saying like you need to delete the messages. Like anything that could possibly expose a patient's a patient's records or a patient's information that might have anything to do with substance use needs to be wiped. It needs to be clean, and that's just a part of good treatment. In terms of even disclosures, one study says disclosures of the purpose patient for health care operation are permitted within written consent in connection to illustrate this as 17 example activities. Another part talks about how I think here, if I can find it, that these records in a part two can't be used by law enforcement against the people. So therefore, if for some reason law enforcement get their hands on these records, and these records indicate substance use, they can't then turn around and persecute them, and for certain things or crimes or charges related to substance use, giving them extra protection. And I think the more important part is letting people know about this, because it's something that's so important, yet a lot of people wouldn't know. And these federally qualified health centers that are a part of this program are in neighborhoods throughout America where a lot of people go to, and a lot of people don't know how to, first advocate, because there's not a lot of education put about this. We talked about consent requirement. A substance use patient may consent to disclose the Part 2 records without naming a specific person as a recipient for disclosure. So therefore, and it says the reason for that is to allow patients to apply for benefits and resources easily. For example, when using online applications that do not identify a specific person as a recipient for the disclosure. So therefore, even protecting your substance use information when you're applying for certain programs, when you're applying for certain benefits and resources, because that unfortunately can be used against you as a way to sort of stigmatize or devalue the application that you just put forth, and it's horrible, because when I'm thinking of even another patient I had in my past who ironically works in this field. Like, a lot of people see substance use as a choice. They don't see it as a disease. They don't see it as a condition. They see it as you've chosen to do something bad, and all the effects, all the primary effects of addiction, whether it be impairment socially, impairment professionally, whether it be getting hooked on the drug, and physically getting like tolerance and having withdrawal symptoms, whether it means you constantly using more and more of your resources, your time, your effort. They put it on you. There are people out there, even in the helping field, that will put it all on you and won't care at all about trying to do something. And so knowing these rights help advocate for yourself, because I talked about how people see facilities as paranoia, and especially people of color, Black people, Hispanic people. A lot of these facilities still don't have enough people of color, and specifically Black doctors and healthcare professionals. And ironically, on another tangent issue, I talked to another patient recently about how, I'm a Black man. Like, they were surprised that a Black man was in such a high position. Like, they'd never seen a Black man had his own office that was giving care. Like, it's usually a white guy or a white woman. Um, and that whole field, and in addition to the fact that there's some people that do either don't understand culturally the people they're dealing with, or are that rigid in terms of how they see substance use and how they see disorders, would lead to a healthy cultural paranoia. That's literally the clinical term. And the unfortunate part is that usually paranoia is seen somewhat as like, I don't want to say delusional, but a stretch, right? Like a warped sense of reality that is not founded, based on, and if you were to really look at everything that is involved with the facts around that paranoia. But the unfortunate truth is that some of this paranoia and some of this fear is founded, because there are professionals out there that will see you as someone that has substance use and will literally use it against you. And so, rights provisions, if I can talk, provisions like these are great, because they help you to think about certain things in terms of how you protect yourself. So if anything does happen, even if you don't remember everything, because like this is like a laundry list of different things, it's good to know, like, hey, here's this bill, and I can check it and see if anything weird has happened to my records, due to people with their own bias and agendas. Because people can have different biases and agendas about what they feel about substance use patients. No one is bias free when it comes to race or culture, but it's your job to fight against that. It's your job to fight your own biases. That's why you have certain things, supervision, where you can talk about counter-transference. And this comes to this issue. Here it is. This is a provision, essentially a law, within federal programs, and even to an extent it sort of goes out to non-federal programs. And not a lot of people know this. I'm pretty sure if I was to mention this off the top of my head and say, "Hey, what's this?" to my some of my colleagues, they wouldn't know. I want to go to some of the other things as provisions, just to kind of get idea what else are the revisions for under the Trump administration for this. So it says undercover agents and informants. Court-ordered placements of undercover agents or informants within a Part 2 program will be extended for 12-month periods, and court will be authorized to extend further. To address department concerns that the current policy is overly restrictive to some ongoing investigations. All right, not sure what that is about, but we'll come back to that. Let's see, audit and edit, research, medical emergencies. Declare medical emergencies resulting from natural disasters that disrupt the treatment facilities and services will meet definition of bona fide medical emergencies for the purpose of disclosing SUD records without patient consent under Part 2. To ensure clinically appropriate communications and access to SUD care, which is substance use disorder care, in the context of declared emergencies. But that's interesting. That's the exception, right? Like, it has to be a natural disaster. It has to be, you see the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the rainstorms that devastate towns. That's happening more and more because of global warming, and because of and climate change, and us not adopting Green New Deal like policies. But it has to be something that dire for us to overlook this. Think about that. Like, it has to be something that dire. So if you don't have a hurricane happening, if you don't have an earthquake tearing up your town, if you do not have a natural disaster tearing your town, and those extreme, extraordinary circumstances, and you even think about possibly leaking someone's substance use disorder, please look up this policy. I will scroll up. I'm on my iPhone here. It's called HHS 42 CFR Part 2. Look it up. It was last revised in August 2019. And so therefore, you can do right by yourself and right by your client. Because I always say legal first. Now we're going to get to the last part of the show. So, here we go. The last section of this podcast, which is I do with so much respect for people who actually do podcasts on a regular basis, because doing this is hard. Talking is hard. It's not hard, but doing it in a committed way to find or finish anything is hard. And it's weird. I was talking to a patient recently about passion and the time and effort that people put into things, and how that being a sign of the things that we're passionate about and the things that we want to get done and the things that maybe we're not so passionate about. And maybe some of these things aren't even things that we're not passionate about, but we just are out of our grasp, at least for right now. And that's something to really think about. So, this podcast has been really about substance use. In the first section, we talked about how it's important to diagnose appropriately, to avoid underdiagnosing, asking the questions, even if there seems to be any evidence or anything that could prompt substance use, to always ask the question. But to not be so easy to diagnose, or I guess so trigger happy with the diagnosis of substance use. And then we talk about how, the reason why, because there's so much consequences. Second session we talked about a provision that even goes further to protect people's substance use diagnosis, in terms of how it's spoken for medical professionals, and how those records are protected from third parties. This one I just talk about my own experience, because I do think, despite the fact that I do feel concerned enough about substance use to make this podcast and make this whole podcast about substance use, and there can be so much about substance use, because honestly, I just talked about diagnosing and underdiagnosing and protecting people's information from the outside world. We could go into the feeling of being intoxicated by any one of these drugs. We can go into some exotic diagnoses about how these symptoms linger once a patient is intoxicated. There's so many different aspects of substance use. So definitely expect, at least from me, as I continue this, if I continue this, to have more substance use podcasts based on just how it feels, and maybe the different addiction models, which goes from the social model, where it's really part of your friends or your family, and it's almost like a socialized norm to do substances, whether it's a award type system that you have for yourself. Some people really do. They feel like, hey, I've been through a hard week of work. Take a drink or get a smoke, and they see that as an award for themselves. And even chemically, what some of these drugs chemically do to us, because I feel like breaking that down in an easy to understand way has always been something that needs to be done more and more, so that people can understand what it is in their body, what is happening to their body when they use some of these drugs, and then go from there, have an opportunity to make as informed of a decision as possible. Because a lot of times you don't know. A lot of people just think, hey, it is what it is, and they don't know the real breakdown of the chemicals and how to respond. They just know, I'm going to use this, and it's going to make me feel like this. And I want to feel like that. Not knowing the long-term consequences or anything of that matter that might affect or could affect their decision to do anything. So I really think there's so much more in terms of substance use, and even substance use in terms of being linked with other diagnoses. There's some diagnoses that have a high prevalence of being linked to substance use disorders, and substance use feeds off of it, and at times either enhances it or makes some of these disorders even more extreme. So, there's tons more. I know if I was to say one off the top of my head, like a personality disorder, like paranoid personality disorder. That is one that can definitely be enhanced in a bad way by feeding off of substance use, feeding off of all those different things that you gain from being hooked to some certain substances. Especially when you think of maybe someone that has paranoid personality disorder, intimate and explosive disorder, and then they use alcohol, which lowers their inhibitions. And now they're even more explosive, and they're taking less caution when doing things that may not be advisable in terms of social norms or being, violent or aggressive for reasons that may not warrant it. So there's tons of things, to talk about substance use. So I would definitely, I enjoy this podcast so far, and I'm going to come back to it. But I still am proud. Like, I still have seen progress. I'm not going to be one of those mental health podcasts that's ever going to be ashamed of my political stance. I'm liberal, left-wing, progressive, whatever you want to say, Green New Deal, defund the police, whatever, all that stuff. I'm that. And I'm not, but even away from my stances, just in its connection to mental health in general, a lot of the realities, the brutal, hard realities, are connected to policy, are connected to who we elect at a state, local, and federal level. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about mixed families, which is a whole other thing, but mixed families is basically saying, hey, if you have families with undocumented people and legal citizens in the same household, they can apply for housing. And the last administration, the Trump administration, tried to get rid of that. That would have been horrible. So, I definitely think, it's the policies are related. But to come back to substance use, there's a lot of states that have decriminalized. Connecticut has decriminalized cannabis. The state above us, Massachusetts, has completely legalized it. There's been more states in this past election cycle that either decriminalized or took steps toward legalization. As it's becoming more and more in use, it's becoming less taboo. It was even to talk about the decriminalization and to talk about this, how the stigma of substance use is so real about anyone that even says anything about that. And I do think it cuts with racial lines as well. I remember, Connecticut's been, they decriminalized stuff for a little bit while. They have not legalized, but they have decriminalized marijuana, and they have made medicinal marijuana legal for a little while now, and I remember even a few years back, I was working somewhere, and it was legal, 100% legal on the books, and no one wanted to talk about it. None of the medical professionals, doctors, social workers, everyone was like, oh, they made you sure about Lucky and 11 and all this other stuff. It's like, it's cannabis, man. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not naughty. It's not, it's a part of life. Without too much, going too far into it because I haven't researched it for this podcast. I like to research everything to kind of know everything. That's me. You can go as far back, thousands of years ago. People used drugs or other substances to temporarily escape their conscious mindset, because there's a lot of stress that comes from being in the know about everything all the time. And so, on some level, this is what we do. And, if cannabis was legalized and it's found to be safe in regular use, which it seemingly has, and it's not been any instantaneous or drastic harm done, it should be something that we should be able to talk about. And we're able to have those more nuanced conversations, because there are some places where maybe cannabis use isn't a good thing in medical practice and relating to mental health practice. As I used to work with a pain specialist that would talk about the dangers of interactions between cannabinoids and other pain medications. But if you're so afraid to even talk about it and even mention cannabis, how are you gonna have a conversation? You know what I mean? Like, we ain't mimes. We're not telepaths. We're not. I mean, some may be, but like, that's not what I am or what most people are. And so the fact that now we can talk about it openly in meetings and whether good or bad, because I started this, I'm not gonna lie, I said in the first part, with a bias that, hey man, everybody's overdiagnosing, everybody's being all trigger happy with the substance use diagnosis, and it's really costing people or putting people at risk for a lot of negative associations, and that's bad. And so I started with that. And I'm still in a part right, because I've seen it, but I was part like not all as right as I thought it was. But the fact that one way or another, that we're just sort of talking about it and we can mention it openly, I think is huge. Because part of the thing, and that goes into a further thing in terms of holding back possible good benefits of drugs and substances that can help people, is that because it's been so restricted in society, and I think restricted as a Schedule 1 drug, we haven't had the freedom to test and research it as freely and as extensively as you would want to. So therefore you would know, okay, in these situations, cannabis helps. In these situations, cannabis don't help. It would be great to have that test and those findings, and it can just build and build. But yet again, progress is made. You're seeing so many people have cannabis companies that sell cannabis that I'm all in favor for, and I'm all a fan of. So many people, celebrities and public figures are fronting cannabis companies. You have so many people that are actually getting their own cannabis company, and it makes me feel that anyone doing it, but specifically black and brown people, because part of the stigma, and I didn't mention it directly. I just didn't think about it at the time, and this is more about just mental health in general, but it is always a factor, is race. These drugs were assigned to certain races to make them seem more deviant and a danger and a risk, and were used as a way to, or as an excuse to lock people up. I mean, that's not a lie. The amount of people, that's in prison for, nonviolent drug offenses is staggering. Oh, and while I'm on this sort of kind of tangent, even though it's not, for states that have medicinal or legal cannabis laws, some of those states have presidents where people who have been locked up can literally get their jail time like immediately expunged and their prison sentence immediately canceled. It's a process, but I actually knew a lawyer that went out of his way to do that. So that's something off the top of my head that I keep forgetting. But yeah, it was racist. The way that, and not the drugs themselves, but the way that these drugs were perceived and were displayed and projected to society by the media, by people who, a lot of these media people who had racist, if not the entire publication was racist, by the government that, at times would work hand in hand with the media to project these sort of racist sentiments, to further demonize and villainize black people and brown people. And it's horrible. And so that's why I'm so overjoyed that these conversations are happening, because hopefully with that being demystified, that's one less thing to say, oh, that black guy's horrible, or that Puerto Rican guy is horrible, and also hopefully we get businesses, because I love that there's dispensaries getting opened up, but to be honest, I want to see black people open up these dispensaries. I want to see black business thrive, because it's weird that we get all the attention, negative attention, legally and in the media for all these drugs, even though it's not even. And I hate talking about all this stuff all loosely, but I don't even think it's 50-50 now. Like before, it used to be like 50-50. We always do the same thing. I think black people, I think it's in their study that we use it less on overall. We use cannabis less, and we're still, and there's still that lingering thing there of like minorities using, drugs. So the more normalized these conversations happen about substance use, the less fanaticism, the less frenzy, the less overproportionate, scared response happens when you see anything related to drugs. And if you just see drugs as what they are, a way to have fun, a way for some people to self-medicate, and a way for some people to escape their unconscious. Things that, if done in excess and if done irresponsibly, can cause great harm. But if done in control, are no problems, and there shouldn't be anyone's issue to check someone if that's what they enjoy. I don't have scientific proof of that, but I know I've seen and heard so many patients who talk about how it has changed their lives. And I've been in situations where I've been around people who are in corporate America who can't survive without it. And not in the sense of being dependent. I'm sure they'll be able to try to find a way to have their job, but it would be a detriment to the performance, because it's the thing that helps them with anxiety. It's the thing that helps them go to meetings. anything to help them to put themselves in difficult situations that are stressful. And, to do something that's so human as trying to deal with stress and compounding stress as we have all these different things that try to either attack us or make us feel a certain way, and to either be criminalized or villainized is horrible. So let's continue to have this conversation. Let's continue to build and grow to make this normal and the treatment of this normal. All right, that's it. My name is Omar Green, LCSW, and this has been the LCSW, the podcast. Until next time, breathe easy.